Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to this session. I'm Dr. Julian Skirm. I'm the university's Director of Social Responsibility, so a lot of my team are putting today on. It's really nice to see so many of you here. Thanks for coming along. Just a quick bit of housekeeping from me before we get over to the main act. You'll notice today we've got microphones inside here. You'll get a bit of ambient noise. We're expecting a band. That's all part of the atmosphere. We are expecting it. One thing that might happen as well, you've noticed as well, we've got some protests on campus. There are encampments around the terrible situation in the world, in Israel and in Palestine. In many universities around the world, we're no different. If any protesters did want to come and say their piece to us, don't be alarmed by that. We would allow that. We're really committed to free speech and respectful dialogue, but we would ask them then. We want to carry on and talk about today's topic as well. And excuse my French, but today's topic is really important. They're not talking shit, but they might be talking about shit and sewage. And also, if you are a bit, you find that a bit disturbing, now's your chance to leave. I'm only joking, but today's topic is really important. It's a really, like clean air, I think our rivers and our water are something that affects all of us across different races, socioeconomic groups and genders in different parts of the world. So this is a topic that is fascinating for people. The amount of public interest in this topic is phenomenal. And Jamie, I think, is one of our colleagues who's been right at the forefront of public debates and really represents, I think, the university at its best, where we're not just doing excellent research, but we're using that knowledge to take debate out into wider society, engage the public, engage policymakers, and try and use our research to make a positive impact on the world. So Professor Jamie Woodward is from the university, and then his colleague Matt Staniek, I think I've said is a campaigner who's been working with Jamie up at Windermere. So they're going to do a double act, but Jamie's going to say more about that. So put your hands together for Professor Jamie Woodward.
Can everybody hear me at the back? We might be competing with a band in a moment, so that could get interesting. Let's see how we go. Yeah, delighted to be here this afternoon. Delighted also to have the brilliant Matt Staniek, who is going to talk about his campaigning at Windermere. This session is going to be in three parts. I'm going to talk about some of the research we've done in the Department of Geography at the University on microplastics in Manchester's rivers, and then I will explain how that is connected to sewage and the sewage scandal that we find ourselves in now. Matt's then going to talk about the campaign that he's leading around the pollution of Lake Windermere. And then in the final third, we're going to open it up for a Q&A. So do think about some questions. Do ask us some questions at the end, and we want to have a chat and a discussion around that. Set of slides here. You might recognise that image. This is the River Irwell that flows through the city centre of Manchester, the city of Salford on the left, the city of Manchester on the right. The River Irwell is the most sewage-infested river in England. Last year, United Utilities dumped almost 12,000 individual sewage dumps in the river. If you're not angry about that, you should be, okay? Interestingly, Manchester City Council have been pretty quiet about that. I've had Salford Council. Andy Burnham hasn't really spoken publicly about that. United Utilities sponsors his big green summit. So that might be a discussion for later. So rivers in the north of England, Yorkshire, particularly Lancashire, Cheshire, Greater Manchester, have been particularly severely hit with sewage pollution by the private water companies. Now, what's that got to do with microplastics? Well, a few years ago, in 2015, we did a project with a PhD student of mine called Rachel Hurley and a colleague, James Rothwell. We took samples from 40 sites on 10 rivers around Greater Manchester, the tributaries of the Irwell and the Mersey, and we found that the riverbeds across the region were contaminated with microplastics. Some of them were very heavily contaminated. That diagram there, the larger the circle, the larger the concentration, the larger the contamination. The pink refers to microplastic fragments. If you look at the image on the side, you can see some pink fragments. The green shows microbeads, circular microbeads, and then we have fibers as well. So we have different assemblages across the region and different concentrations. In some places, the concentrations are really very high, up to 50,000 microplastic particles per kilogram of fine sediment. Why does this matter? Well, if the riverbed, the quality of the riverbed underpins the whole aquatic ecosystem. Many creatures live there, many creatures feed there, many creatures reproduce there. So if you feed in that environment, if the riverbed is contaminated with microplastics, there's a much greater chance that those microplastics are going to get into the food chain. one of my PhD students, Badio, is at the back here. Badio's been working on microplastics in fish. He's on the River Tame and has found microplastics in every single fish that he's analysed, in almost every single organ. So we know that these microplastics are getting into the food chain. So we've got microplastics across the region. Now, you may remember Boxing Day 2015, we had record flooding on the River Irwell. So in early 2016, we went out and resampled all these sites to see what impact those floods had on those microplastics. And you notice most of the circles have got smaller. So the good news is that floods will wash those microplastics away. There's one site at the bottom, the big green blob. I'll mention that later. So in 2016, we got a handle on the processes, and we showed for the first time that floods will wash microplastics away. We didn't know that before. We didn't even know that the riverbeds were contaminated with microplastics. So I'll come back to that. And even a moderate flood will wash these microplastics away. Now, the way we take our samples, this is James Rothwell and on the River Tame. We have a large metal cylinder. We push it into the riverbed. We isolate a portion of the riverbed. We then disturb the gravels and the water, and the fine sediments and microplastics come up into suspension. We take a big 20-litre bottle of muddy water back to the lab. We extract the microplastics, and then we count them. So we're looking at microplastics that are stored on the riverbed. Now, what we found is in that first phase of our work is that microplastics are found in all parts of these catchments. Some reaches are very heavily contaminated. We have varied microplastic assemblages, but flood events will wash those microplastics downstream. So those microplastics must be regularly replenished. So this piece of research, we published it in Nature Geoscience in 2018. It's been cited since then 754 times. So it's had an impact on the discipline. But it raised some really interesting questions. If floods flush microplastics away, how do the riverbeds get contaminated in the first place? That's a really important question. So we started thinking about the sources of those microplastics and how do these hotspots form? There's a hotspot here that became known as the Denton hotspot. That was the most contaminated site in the world at that time. 2015, it was half fibers, half microbeads, half fragments. 2016, it was 98% microbeads, this big green blob here. So that hotspot had been washed away and then reformed in a matter of weeks. So these hotspots can form very, very quickly if we've got wastewater coming into the river that's heavily contaminated with microplastics. So we started thinking about the sources, where they're coming from. This is a wastewater treatment plant. Microplastics come from all sorts of locations. They come from industry. They come from domestic wastewater. They come from geography professors washing their fleeces. They come from, that was a gag, okay. They come from rubber and from brake dust. And they should all go to a wastewater treatment plant, because we have a combined sewer system in England and Wales and Scotland. They should go to a wastewater treatment plant where all that material is treated so that nice, clear, blue water is returned to our rivers to maintain the quality of the water, to maintain the quality of the ecosystems, and also to keep those rivers safe for public health. But of course, we know that hasn't been happening. Many wastewater treatment plants, particularly in the north of England, have been discharging raw sewage into our rivers, and it's become routine. What we've done with our research is we've connected the sewage scandal with the microplastic problem. So every time untreated wastewater is discharged into a river, billions of microplastics are also discharged into the river. If you look at this map here, top of the table, the worst polluter in England is United Utilities that supply your drinking water if you live in this part of the world, and are also responsible for taking away your wastewater. Unfortunately, a significant amount of that ends up straight back in the river or into a coastal site without any treatment. Now, water companies are allowed to discharge untreated wastewater under what's called exceptional circumstances, so when a river's in flood. Now, we know that floods wash microplastics away, so how the hell do the rivers get contaminated in the first place? So we started looking at this and thinking about how do the microplastics get onto the riverbed in such high concentrations? Some of these microplastics are what we call primary microplastics. They're microbeads. They're manufactured for a particular purpose. They haven't degraded from larger plastic items in the river. They're connected to the wastewater incontrovertibly. So the presence of those microbeads tells us that the wastewater treatment isn't happening. So we published, this is my lockdown paper. We published this paper in May 2021. We did a detailed study of the River Tame, and we were asking this question: how do microplastics get onto the riverbeds in such high concentrations? And basically we concluded, here we show how untreated wastewater laced with microplastics and raw sewage is routinely discharged into UK river flows that are too low to disperse the microplastics downstream. And the paper, Acute Riverine, not the snappiest title, Microplastic Contamination Due to Avoidable Releases of Untreated Wastewater. The draft was deliberate releases, but we thought that was too provocative. So we were able to demonstrate that water companies were discharging untreated wastewater into rivers when they were at low flow. And that's the only way you can get large concentrations of microplastics accumulating on the riverbed. Because if they were discharging it into flooded rivers, which is what their permits tell them to do, those microplastics would be washed away and we would never see them. So we started off with a curiosity-driven piece of environmental science, and we ended up developing a tool that could identify illegal water company behavior. When that paper was published, United Utilities released a statement on the very day trying to undermine the research, saying it was a missed opportunity. They challenged our sampling strategy. They suggested there was other sources of microplastics like recycling plants that we hadn't looked at. It was a load of nonsense. And they also said they were doing their own research on microplastics. 3 years later, they haven't published that research on microplastics, and they haven't published a better explanation for our data set and the conclusions that we reached in that paper. And lo and behold, and Matt will show you, over the last 3 years since that paper was published, there have been a whole slew of studies that have showed water companies are routinely discharging river on what we call dry weather spills. I don't like the term spills because it suggests it's accidental. But basically dumping untreated wastewater and sewage into rivers during dry weather, which is illegal, it's breaching their permits. So this got a lot of media attention. Matt and I were on Paul Whitehouse's Our Troubled Rivers, lots of coverage in the newspapers because plastic pollution has been a big issue over the last few years, and the sewage scandal really took off in 2021. This is also having impacts at Westminster. I'll show you this little clip here from the Earl of Caithness talking about our research in the House of Lords when the Environment Bill was going through the Commons. This was really important because this was the landmark piece of legislation to replace the environmental legislation that was lost when we left the European Union. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. This seems such like a long time ago now. But he's talking to Zach Goldsmith.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Minister for bringing forward the amendments he has and for his commitment to review Schedule 3. That was something that I asked for in committee, and I'm delighted that he's going to do that. The new point that I want to ask is, has he been briefed on the latest research from the University of Manchester that has demonstrated a direct link between poor wastewater management and high levels of microplastic pollution in the United Kingdom? What is clearly happening is when we have these overflows, the microplastics are going out into the water system, and not into the rivers but into the sea. So we're actually negating a whole lot of good that the government have been trying to do in reducing microplastics.
Indeed. And the Earl of Caithness is now my favourite peer. Okay. So 2021 was a crazy year. We gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, gave presentations to Ofwat, gave presentations to DEFRA, did a field demonstration down in Oxford to Philip Dunn there, who's the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. He did a big report, his committee on water quality in rivers, that was published in 2022. That report recommended there should be a national survey of microplastic contamination in rivers using the methodology that we've developed here in Manchester. So this research is having impact at Westminster and beyond. And this is Richard Standerwick for the Environment Agency, who's the lead for their monitoring strategy. We've been helping them develop that monitoring strategy for microplastics, rolling it out across the whole of England. So that's a very positive outcome of our research. Interestingly, you may know, was that May 2023, the water companies offered an apology. Ruth Kelly is their new chair. I'm not sure she realised what she'd let herself in for when she took on that job. But water and sewage companies in England apologised for sewage spills and launched a massive transformation programme. So the cat's out the bag now. This has been a PR disaster for the water companies. There's a big broader picture. This is my last slide, in that this isn't just about Greater Manchester's rivers or even the UK rivers. The best way to keep microplastics out of rivers is to treat the wastewater. That's what you pay your bills to do. And there's a lot of evidence that shows when wastewater treatment happens, you can remove 99% of the microplastics. Without any special technical fixes, existing wastewater treatment practices will remove most of the microplastics. The oceans are full of microplastics. Most of those microplastics come from rivers. So to keep microplastics out of the oceans, you need to keep microplastics out of rivers. And to keep microplastics out of rivers, the best way to do that is to treat that wastewater. We're now getting microplastics contaminating the Arctic Ocean from wastewater in Northwest Europe, from wastewater in North America. So there's a much broader geography and a much broader responsibility that we have to make sure that that water is treated. Matt, let me pass over to you. And I'm just going to acknowledge all my colleagues in geography who've helped out with this research.
Thanks. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Is that all right? I've got to work out. I'm known for shouting, so I've got to make sure that no one outside can hear me. I just want to thank Jamie very quickly for inviting me to come down. What's really fascinating about this niche, which is people campaigning for rivers, is that each individual, each group then seems to have, the river that they're representing. For Jamie, it's the Irwell, and for me, I'm here on behalf of Lake Windermere. How do I fix this? I'll give you 2 seconds because there's a nice visual image to start the presentation with. So I started the campaign 3 years ago, so it was roughly the time that Jamie was talking in July 2021. And my campaign started because I broke my neck in a neck brace, and I started going down to the head of Windermere every single day when I was in my neck brace and was very debilitated and wasn't being able to walk on the fells like I usually do. And it was in this period of time, particularly after the COVID years, that I saw, when people returned to the national park, a very, very sharp decline in the freshwater ecology around Windermere. And that's when I discovered what had happened, which was that United Utilities has been dumping untreated sewage into Windermere for decades. Just waiting on the presentation to start. So when it loads, what you'll see is Windermere bright green, and this is what Windermere has become synonymous with, and that is the algal blooms within Windermere itself. So the issue with that is it's excessive nutrient into the system. What we primarily talk about with Windermere is phosphorus levels. So the phosphorus levels are essentially fertilizer for the algae. So we have lots of the fertilizer, lots of the phosphorus, then you get lots of algae. So essentially what Windermere is it's saturating in this nutrient because not enough has been done to ensure the long-term protection of Windermere. Algae can be naturally occurring in a lot of circumstances. So here it is. I don't know how well you can see that with the sunshine, but that image there was taken on Windermere on the 13th of August 2022, and it was when 5 miles of the lake was engulfed in this blue-green algal bloom. This blue-green algae, so we're on a mission to save Windermere, so I'm backtracking a bit through the slides. So the big problem with the algae is it not only is it potentially toxic to you, the cyanobacteria within the lake itself, but it also has a massive impact on the wildlife itself. It's not just in the summer months. You tend to see the blue-green algal blooms in the summer months, but that image there was taken on the 16th of December. It was when the ground was rock hard, and so these algal blooms can persist into the winter months. It all depends on the species and things like that. So the danger is, when you get this extensive algal growth, is essentially it goes quite prolific in bad circumstances, and when the algae dies, it sinks to the bed of the lake and it undergoes a decomposition process. And in that decomposition process, it absorbs lots of oxygen. So if you get a bloom that's big enough, then the oxygen depletion within the watercourse can be so severe that it can cause fish kills. And this is something that's happened within the Windermere catchment. So I don't know how many of you are aware of Windermere and the topography, but there's a 3-basin lake called Elterwater. And in the 1990s, that underwent this eutrophication process. There was a mass fish kill, and that was a result of sewage going into Elterwater. But it's also seen on various cases. There's a saltwater lagoon in the south of Spain called Mar Menor that once again has eutrophication. They've got quite a lot of different sources like pig farming, but they had mass algal blooms. In the last few years alone, they've had 3 mass fish kills. So this is the big fight, and this is the conversation that we're having surrounding Windermere. So the issue is that not enough has been done to protect Windermere in the face of a changing climate. We have seen reductions of input, and that tends to come as a result of the water company, the Environment Agency, see something that startles them, and then they see a mitigation process to try and reduce the input. So we have seen reductions. But as our climate continues to change, not enough has been done to ensure the long-term protection of the lake. And the 2 circumstances that we're seeing within climate change that are really concerning is increased rainfall, which is going to increase sewage discharging because the infrastructure around Windermere is inadequate, and we're going to see the increased risk of droughts. And going back to the excessive nutrient in the lake feeding the algal growth, the algae can proliferate when the lake is warm and dry. So when we see that initial image of the entire North Basin, that was a particularly dry period of time, and that's why we saw such a massive algal growth. And this is just simply, like I said, because not enough has been done to protect Windermere. That's the issue at the heart of this. As a example of the impact that sewage has on the environment, just as a visual representation. Above, you've got no United Utilities input. It's up on Great Langdale Beck, and you can see it's full of life. We've done quite a lot of invertebrate surveys up there. You're talking 25 to 30 to 35 species, abundant species diversity. Really, really healthy for a Lake District Beck. On the right-hand side, you're about 100 metres downstream of United Utilities' final treated effluent pipe, and what you can see on all those sticks is sewage fungus engrossing the river, and that kind of comparison was what stemmed that to me to say, what's going on here, what's wrong? Because fundamentally, I'm not a freshwater ecologist. A lot of this has been a self-learning exercise over 3 years, but I just saw that and knew that something was wrong with the rivers. So the problem with Windermere, United Utilities, both currently and historically, has been the largest contributor of the phosphorus into Windermere, and they are essentially the leading cause of this. In 2012, they released a statement in which they said, the analysis of the data shows that if you were to remove all of United Utilities discharging from Windermere, that algal blooms would still occur, but the severity would be reduced to the point where it may not actually be visible. And that was at their last round of investment. And they essentially decided at that moment in time that it was cheaper to look at reducing their input than removing their input into Windermere. So these decisions are being made by the water industry on the basis of cost, and it's cost savings over the protection of our environment. When I talk about United Utilities input, since 2020, they've discharged over 27,700 hours worth of untreated sewage in the Windermere catchment, all of which has then gone into Windermere Lake itself. The untreated sewage is just part of this conversation because not a lot of people are aware that even with treated sewage, it still contains the nutrient that feeds the algal growth. And the Environment Agency is permitting from just 6 of United Utilities assets in the catchment up to 13 million litres a day in treated sewage. What we've then demonstrated with a piece of research that we undertook, which was funded by the UK Space Agency, is that there was a direct correlation in recent years towards the amount of people that were in Windermere and algal biomass within the lake. It was looking at chlorophyll A concentration in the lake from satellite imagery and using mobile data to have population loading within the area to see what happens then. What the BBC covered was that it was the tourism influx that was causing Windermere to go green. But what we're saying is that actually this is about pressure on inadequate infrastructure. Fundamentally, everyone should be able to come to the Lake District. It is the most beautiful place in the entire world. If you haven't been there, I recommend you going. But this is, again, it's about inadequate investment in infrastructure to ensure the sustainable development of the area. So that's one of the pieces of work that we've recently undertaken. What we also demonstrated in that was that there was a direct correlation between temperature and algal biomass in the lake. So as the lake gets warmer, we see more algae. As we see more people in Windermere, we see more algae. And that image that I demonstrated, well, the one that's there on the left-hand side, what we saw was that there was actually more people in Windermere when the COVID lockdown ended, but we saw more algae in the lake in 2022 because we had that prolonged dry spell within the lake. So it shows that unadaptability to the system and the real need to address the root causes of this issue. So I've said this time and time again, they're not addressing the urgent need to invest in the infrastructure to ensure the long-term protection of Windermere. Jamie's mentioned it briefly, that we have illegal spilling. We work quite closely with a group called Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. Professor Peter Hammond has exposed the nationwide illegality that we see across the country. And there's not only dry spilling, but there's flow to full treatment non-compliance, which I suspect in the Q&A we have the potential to go into a bit more detail with it. But around Windermere, we've got, or Professor Hammond has demonstrated it, Ambleside, Hawkshead Pumping Station, near Sorry, Grasmere, Glebe Road Pumping Station, they've all spilled illegally in recent years. And this is fundamentally due to lack of capacity within the sewage network. So our vision for the future is we've just recently released a 10-point plan as to what we deem is the most appropriate approach to end sewage pollution in Windermere. We've split this into short-term and long-term approaches. What we've put in the short term is essentially things that can be implemented across the country and is not just a Windermere-specific solution. So I know Jamie talks about it quite a lot, the need for volumetrics on untreated sewage spilling, real-time monitoring of sewage spilling, and then the long-term approach is things like greater protection for the lake and end to sewage discharging into the lake itself. What we are calling for is we're calling for what has been achieved in lakes all around the world, which is a long-term infrastructural investment plan that completely removes input into the lake. Our number one case study is Lake Annecy in France. They have differences in that one's an alpine lake, one's a lowland lake, but they have a lot of similarities. But fundamentally, what we're really keen on is we're keen on saying that this is about the long-term infrastructure investment plan. Is that chiming because I've come to 15 minutes? No, that's all right then. If I'm not careful, it'll be 3 hours later and you'll still be sat here, so I'm very, very conscious of it. So what we're saying is what happened in Annecy was in the 1960s, they saw an increase in algal blooms and they saw declines in their fish populations. And they addressed this at the root cause in that they put in a long-term infrastructural investment plan, and there's now no sewage being discharged into Lake Annecy. It's classified as the cleanest lake in Europe. It still remains in an oligotrophic state. Windermere in its natural state would be an oligotrophic lake, which means that naturally it would be so low in nutrient that algal blooms are unlikely or do not occur in oligotrophic lakes. So what we're seeing in Windermere is due to anthropogenic pressure within the area, and it's because we have never addressed the root cause of this issue, which is putting sewage into a lake is a bad thing. So that's Windermere in 2022, and that's Lake Annecy. And like I say, you can't have direct comparisons. They are different in many respects, but that is a lake that's free from sewage, and that's a lake that since 2020 alone has seen 27,700 hours worth of untreated sewage find its way into its waters. So what we do as a campaign, we're across 4 sort of foundations where you have the data and evidence. I've referenced one of our projects very, very briefly. We have a lot of awareness, so if you guys look out in The Guardian on Tuesday, you'll see a piece of work which we'll be placing within there, which is part of our 10-point plan for the long-term protection of Windermere. We do a lot of political lobbying. We recently met with Angela Rayner, we've met with Steve Reed, we've met with the Lib Dems, we've met with the Green parties, we've met with the current Conservative government, because fundamentally these choices that we're seeing are political choices. If the politicians want to address this, they will enforce the law, they will give the regulator the right amount of funding to be able to do their statutory duty, and we would not see untreated sewage in our lakes and our rivers. This is fundamentally the issue that we face. And then we were exploring quite a lot of legal challenges and legal options that we have in front of us. Again, that's something that I'd look out for in the next few weeks alone. But that's really where I am. I'm quite keen to open it to a Q&A because a lot of this detail... Have I? So I guess as well, it's not just me behind the campaign. When I first started the campaign, it was just me. And for about a year and a half, 2 years, I just ran this on my own. But we're now set up as a not-for-profit community interest company. We have a board of directors. Finn Patterson, who couldn't be here today, he's heavily involved in helping run this, but we have a whole list of experts that sit behind the scenes within this that are helping us not only with the research and their expertise, but they're helping direct the campaign as to what we really need to do to address this issue. So I think I'm quite aware now that I have to steer the conversation away from it's just me to being there is a whole team behind us that is really helping steer this. So there's a couple of things that you can do almost immediately. Our 10-point plan to save Windermere, that's something that you can go onto our website and you can sign in support of. It breaks it down as to what we mean by the specific asks in both the short term and long term. We've got a lot of campaign films. It's part of our awareness of the campaign is we like to make short, informative films that tries to reach a different demographic that doesn't necessarily turn up to Manchester Uni to listen to a lecture and things like that. It's a very powerful means to get the message across there. In the last year alone, our social media has made over 9 million impressions. So it's an incredibly powerful tool for those that think that they want to start campaigning or start raising awareness. Social media is an incredible tool. And we've just released a crowdfunder. Just 3 days ago, we've just raised, I think we're about £12,000 at this point in time. So over 3 days, this again breaks down what we do, who we are, what our mission is, and what our end objective is. But that's it for me. If we want to open it now to a Q&A with Jamie. Next one.
Thank you very much. So Jamie and Matt, if you come and grab some seats, I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, so we're going to open up. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so please just put your hands up and I'll come round and pass you a microphone. So the lady in the red jumper, sounds like question time now, doesn't it? The lady in the red jumper.
Thank you both very much for your campaign about this really important and disturbing issue. What, in practice, would you do to increase the capacity of the sewage system? Because at the moment there's too much rainwater going into it in storms. So what would you do to stop that?
Do you want to take that, Matt?
Yeah, I'll take it.
You should still be mic'd.
So, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, fine. So, I guess it's one of the issues since privatisation is that when the water companies were privatised, we saw a slight increase in investment, but as time's gone on, the investment has just plummeted off a cliff. They're not investing in the infrastructure. When we talk about the combined system, the water industry loves to blame the Victorians. This is the Victorian infrastructure and all that kind of nonsense. There's a report from United Utilities, and off the top of my head, I think it's actually that only 12% of the infrastructure across the nation is from the Victorian era. It's all skewing us away from the fundamental issue is that they are not investing in the infrastructure. And it's not just about storm spilling, it's not just about rainfall. 70% of spilling that we see nationwide is due to infiltration into the network, and that's because they've not been investing. That's what this all falls down to. It's a lack of investment by the billion industry whilst they've abstracted £72 billion of your money to shareholders. That's the fundamental issue here. We just need investment to increase capacity storage, deal with infiltration to ensure our system's adaptable to a changing climate. Anything else?
Yeah, there has been investment in the system, but they've completely got the balance wrong in terms of profits and dividends to shareholders. Privatisation was 1989. We're now in the 5th decade of privatisation. So we need to increase the capacity of wastewater treatment. United Utilities has about 470 wastewater treatment works across the northwest of England. And they've known for a long time which of those are spilling illegally. And this problem could have been solved a long time ago if the investment was in place.
Got the gentleman here and then here next.
So, just for what you said there, I'm just trying to understand, is the fundamental problem that, sorry, there you go, that's better. Is the fundamental problem that they are knowingly, essentially, opening up the taps into the rivers, or is the problem that the infrastructure is just so leaky, or is it both?
Yeah, it's not really, there's no like person at United Utilities that sits there and presses a button and it opens it into the rivers. And I guess one thing we're quite cautious of as a campaign is that this is not about those that are on the ground. I've met a lot of United Utilities staff members that really care, are really trying to do the best that they can. But this is about the level of investment that they're putting back into the company to ensure that they're not squeezing the assets. It's just simply the fact that they haven't invested. There's a lot of leaking infrastructure. The capacity is just pushed past it, and the result of that is that sewage is then finding its way into our watercourses. So it all just falls down to the lack of investment.
Just on the River Irwell, for example, if you go to Bolton Wastewater Treatment Works and Bury Wastewater Treatment Works, some of those sites are spilling for 1,800 hours a year. And so it's become routine. So investment is critical to increase the capacity. The other excuse the water companies use, of course, is that it rains in Manchester. I mean, that's not a surprise. That's kind of common knowledge. It also rains in the Lake District. So United Utilities, the water companies, have lots of clever people who've been predicting and understanding climate change in terms of how much they charge for your drinking water, planning drinking water resources. We know that there's going to be more storms in the future and the weather's becoming storm. We should have planned for this a long time ago. But there's a need for greater transparency in terms of what they're doing, and there's a need for much greater investment. You may or may not know that all the private water companies in England are currently under investigation. There's a criminal investigation that's ongoing by Ofwat and the Environment Agency. It's a bit like a West End farce. And then the Environment Agency and Ofwat are under investigation by the new Office for Environmental Protection and DEFRA as well to see whether they've actually been fulfilling their statutory duties. So those investigations are all ongoing. One of the problems at the moment is you can't get any information about the water companies because that investigation is ongoing. United Utilities have kind of closed many of their social media accounts. They're just hunkering down at the moment. It's very difficult to get any information out of them. But we do need much greater transparency in terms of, I've argued, for volumes of sewage. They give us the data on how often they spill and for how many hours. But we need to know whether that's a trickle or whether it's a tsunami, because it's very easy to fudge the data and to have huge volumes. You can reduce your spill frequency but still increase your volumes. So we need much greater transparency across the whole the whole area.
To give an example as well of that idea of volume, there was a recent spill, you might have seen it in the BBC, 10 million litres was released into Windermere in a single night from one pumping station. You know, this isn't just trickles, this is huge volumes that are heading into our waterways. And like Jamie's saying, until you have full transparency of data, we're only scratching the surface on this matter. And it's not just United Utilities that withholds the data. The Environment Agency actively withholds data. They're breaching their statutory duties for having to provide this information to the general public. And until we have that, we don't really know the true extent of what's happening, which is quite terrifying.
The talk, very, very interesting. Shouldn't we take the water companies back into public ownership? And are we the only country in the world that doesn't own its own water?
I get asked this, and it feels like a much bigger topic than I can really add my opinion to, because I'm fundamentally here talking about Windermere. I guess for me personally, what I tend to see is what is the net shareholder contribution that we're benefiting from by having the shareholders there. Professor David Hall from Greenwich University, an economist, he recently did a piece of work which was looking at United Utilities books. And since privatisation, the net shareholder contribution to United Utilities Limited has been minus £14 billion. You know, so what are we gaining from having shareholders there, apart from the bill payers' money is being abstracted and sent a lot of the time out of the country, because a lot of these shareholders are in foreign hands. So it feels like a much bigger conversation for me to have. I just think that we need fundamental reform within this system. The privatised industry has failed, the regulation is failing, and until we have that reform, this continues. That's my I don't know what yours is.
Yeah, no, bringing the water companies back into public ownership is not a straightforward process. And let's say Keir Starmer's the next Prime Minister, he's not going to want to take on that debt, because the debts are huge. But there's a broader issue here as well about regulation. Let's say it stays as private companies, but the regulation has failed completely. The water companies since 2010 have effectively been operating in a regulation-free environment. There was a minister at DEFRA, I think, was she called Liz Truss? I don't know what happened to her, but she slashed the Environment Agency's monitoring budget in half. So effectively, they lost the capacity to monitor what the water companies were doing. There are lots of excellent professionals at the Environment Agency, and some of my former students who are frustrated because they don't have the resources to do the job that they want to do. And they've had very poor leadership in recent years as well. They've effectively been captured, in effect. All the power is still with the water companies. So Ofwat and the Environment Agency did much greater investment. And then also the other thing that happened, which is a disaster, is in 2010, the water companies were given the right to self-report their own discharges. Okay? They mark their own homework. It's like putting speeding motorists in charge of speed cameras. So that has been a disaster as well, as Peter Hammond's data analysis has shown. So there's a general election coming up, of course, and the parties are writing their manifestos as we speak. What I'm encouraged by is that campaigning works. Campaigning, whether it's Windermere, whether it's Ilkley, whether it's the Windrush, that draws attention and it draws investment. So my advice, if you have a look at your local river and you're worried about sewage pollution, write to your MP, complain to United Utilities, make a noise, have a campaign, and it does make a difference. But we've got to keep the pressure on.
Particularly at this moment in time as well, we've got a real opportunity now, because water is one of the top agendas politically in the country. And I personally will be casting my vote depending on what the parties are offering when they actually reform, whether they're actually going to reform this system. Because this is a basic human right. The country's set to run out of water by 2050 because we've not seen a single reservoir built since privatisation. This isn't just about sewage, this is about drinking water, and this is something that, unless we get on top of, we're all going to be impacted by in the near future. So it's one that the politicians have to take seriously, and the way that's going to happen is if we all start voicing this and start speaking up.
Hi. Thanks for this talk. It's right down the avenue that I'm looking at. I work as a volunteer for Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust, and given this campaign's going to take a long time to take effect, what can the charitable trusts like ours do, if you like, at the end of pipe to start cleaning up the rivers until we enact this compliance with water discharges? Is there anything we can do, such as reed beds, things like that in the river, that will oxygenate the river?
In the urban environment as well, there's a much broader issue about green infrastructure, about taking pressure off the system, about reducing the amount of rainwater that goes into the sewerage system. The fundamental issue here is monitoring the quality of our rivers. That hasn't been happening. Monitoring the quality of wastewater and basically increasing infrastructure, increasing investment to make sure wastewater isn't discharged into rivers. We've been here before in Manchester. 20 years ago, I was on the Mersey Basin Campaign Scientific Committee when the River Mersey won the World Rivers Prize for being the most improved and the cleanest river. And when I was a kid growing up on the Mersey in the 1970s, it was the dirtiest river in Europe. But the tragedy is, we've been here before. We've seen the fish come back into the Mersey, and then we're going backwards again. And there's a recent study by the University of Durham showing that sewage pollution in the Mersey estuary has got worse in the last 10 years. It's worse than it's ever been.
We've got time for 2 more
Campaigning,
questions. So
Pete.
the gentleman here and then you and next. So gentleman in the purple.
Hello. I'd just like to ask, regardless of where anyone stands on the issue of Brexit, what the effect of Britain leaving the European Union? I know the European Commission monitors pollution levels. I'd just like to ask what regulation of how much effect to what extent has Brexit made this issue worse, if at all, because we no longer have the European Commission able to levy fines on the water companies and the Environment Agency or whoever? Thanks.
Yeah, well, the OEP, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is the UK's version of the European Commission, and it's just seemingly, even though they're investigating, it just seems to be another toothless regulator that's been put in place to act like, we're getting on top of the issue, when in reality, all we fundamentally need is the enforcement of the law. Lots of these laws and legislations are in place, some of which are coming over from the European legislation, and the regulator and the government are not enforcing these laws. And it really falls down to a lot of these circumstances. I mean, Jamie talked about the exceptional circumstance law. That's part of the Urban Wastewater Directive 1991. That's when we're supposed to see untreated sewage. The European Commission took the UK government to court in 2012 based off the fact that the British government was not enforcing that law. That's what this falls down to fundamentally.
But sewage was dumped in our rivers on an industrial scale before 2016, and it's been dumped in our rivers on an industrial scale post 2016. We just want the regulators to enforce the law.
I guess going back to the question as well about the nature-based solutions that we can implement on this, I think we have to be very, very careful within this circumstance when we start talking about nature-based solutions, because that tends to be a very, very cheap way for the water companies to sit there and say, look, we're really helping our local nature reserves, we're planting X amount of reed beds, and it's a distraction tool. It leads us away from the fundamental issue, which is the investment in the infrastructure. We see this with what's called an enforcement undertaking. If there's a pollution incident, I think one of the ones recently was Yorkshire Water. There was a pollution incident that was caused by a sewage spill, killed an entire river, and what they did was they donated £1 million or £500,000 to the local Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and they would then go off and plant reed beds and things like that. There's no prosecution, no one's to blame, and it's just a cheap alternative that leads us away from investing that money into the infrastructure. So I think we've got to be really, really careful on what is actually going to benefit biodiversity net gain. Things are going to improve water quality, but there's also a massive greenwashing exercise that's undertaken by Water UK that steers us away from really fundamental reform.
The fundamental problem is dumping sewage on an industrial scale is spectacularly profitable, and that's still the case, and that has to change.
And we've got time for one more question here.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess my question is really voicing and campaigning for this is really important, and I appreciate everything you're doing. You seem to be doing a great job at that. My question is, for really the normal taxpayer, the homeowner, is there anything that we can do practically in our everyday life to in the way that we consume water to actually help and to put extra pressure on companies like the ones you mentioned? And maybe my second question is a bit more personal for me. Is it a bad idea to drink tap water in Manchester?
I would say someone will be campaigning for your local river. And I can almost guarantee it. This isn't just us two sat here. This is something that's happening nationwide. Find your nearest campaign and support them in any way that they can. When it comes to drinking water and tap water, it's one that I would start thinking about. I personally don't drink it anymore. And one thing that's something to consider is the water companies are actually dosing drinking water with phosphorus, and it's to counteract lead pipes within the system that haven't been removed since privatisation. I think there's another conversation to be had surrounding that sort of system in place, but when it comes to what you can do, support these campaigns. There's a group called Windrush Against Sewage Pollution. They are leading this when it comes to nationally exposing this issue about illegal dumping of sewage. The criminal investigation that Jamie was referring to came off the back of the work of Professor Peter Hammond. There are phenomenal campaigners that are experts within this field that need your help to help elevate this point. For me here today, I'm here on behalf of England's largest lake, and the benefit that I have is that because Windermere is so known not nationally but also internationally, is that I can take an issue and raise it into the national press because it's happening to Windermere, the jewel in the crown of the national park. And I think it's important to have these flagship sites or these organisations that are doing such phenomenal work to elevate them in the national narrative, because that's what politicians really fear, is putting the truth on the table.
We're not advocating anybody stops drinking. We haven't got information on the quality of the drinking water. Let's assume it's fine. But get involved in your local rivers trust. There'll be a local rivers trust whichever river you are. But what's encouraging Matt's running a brilliant campaign at Windermere, is that the sewage scandal was not exposed by the Environment Agency. It wasn't brought to light by Ofwat. It wasn't brought to light by the regulators. It was brought to light by campaigners and university researchers. That blew the lid off it in 2021. And it's been in the limelight ever since, and it's a key factor in the election. In fact, Keir Starmer, when he made his response to the announcement of the election, it was the first thing that he mentioned. So we've put it, a whole group of people have put this on the map, and so this is a really important time now to write to your MPs to make sure that change happens, because things can only get better.
Very good way to finish up. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone, Matt and Jamie, when I say how fascinating that was. It's been a really stimulating talk. I think a lot of people now are empowered with more information about what you can do, both personally and politically. And I think that's the best example of campaigners and academics working together to raise a really important issue for us all. So please put your hands together for Matt and Jamie. If any of you need to know what else to do, or you've got any questions, please just hang about, come and speak to me or anybody else with a lanyard on. We'll try and help you. But do go out there. There's lots more going on. There's a music performance here in half an hour, a band called Girl, women from around the world, feminism and music. They're absolutely amazing. They were speaking earlier. If you want to stay for that, you can. But lots of other things to enjoy. So please enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks very much.